I was in college, well, I had a project at one point to examine racial relations in a piece of children's media of my choice. I happened to be aware that there was a episode in the first season of My Little Pony: Friendship is Magic that dealt with, it was basically a race relations allegory and a sort of an Aesop as to why prejudice is wrong. And I thought, hey, it was only, I think it was in 2012 I made this, so it was only a couple. I think the episode might have been a couple years old. I don't even remember when My Little Pony: Friendship is Magic came out because I don't care. I didn't care. I still don't care. I had younger family members I know who watched the show, so I was interested to see what kind of messages they were getting knowing that there was an episode that dealt with a race relations allegory. I was able to talk to people I knew in college and personal friends, some of whom were described themselves as bronies, some were described themselves as anti-brony, and so I was able to get a lot of different perspectives on the episode and on the fandom and on race relations within members of the fandom, and I was more importantly able to just hear their take on the episode itself. I watched most of the first season of Friendship is Magic to get a sense of how a typical episode was structured, how the characters were used, and how they were used in other episodes as compared to in this episode. And I based my criticism on that. I'm glad that this project was made at the time it was, because if I were to make something like this now, I'm sure people would accuse me of trying to get the show canceled or trying to say that the show is bad or evil or racist, and that I wanted to say that people who like the show or like this episode are racist. I don't feel that way at all. I'm just examining this one episode and giving my examination and my take on it. I feel like, as a race relations allegory aimed at small children, this episode was flawed. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't mean. They were trying to do a good thing, and they possibly made a perfectly fine generic episode of a cartoon, but as a race relations allegory, I feel like this episode does not hold up and does not do its job. You may feel differently. That's perfectly fine. I am, to this day, I'm neither a fan nor I don't care about My Little Pony. I am indifferent to it. Not indifferent. I am disinterested in My Little Pony, and I believe because of that, I am able to take a very unbiased perspective, and I'm really examining this from a writing standpoint, because my background is in writing, including writing for television and writing for children, and that's a lot of the sort of what I bring to my examination of it, and like I said, I'm glad I made it when I did, because I was free to make it without having to worry about trying to play into certain political trends or anything like that. I just made it earnestly based on my own feelings. There's some things that, looking back on it, I feel maybe I was too critical on. There's some points that I feel like I should have been more critical on. I did take an angry reviewer kind of tone with my delivery and my writing of that I deliver via voiceover. Mind you, this was aimed at my fellow college students in 2012, so doing a James Rolfe or Doug Walker style over-the-top angry reviewer persona was kind of the way to appeal to them and keep them interested. I sort of regret that now. I wish I was a little more myself. But I still think I made a video that I'm really proud of, even though there's some aspects I would rather or wish were spruced up. There's some times where I had to redo bits of audio, and you could tell that by the time I went back to redo the audio, my voice, like I had like a cold or something, and the conditions in my room, which had no air conditioning, I had to run fans to keep from passing out. So some technical aspects suffered, but it's a video I'm very proud of. I spent a long time making it, with equipment that wasn't exactly, fully up to speed, but I made it anyway, and I'm proud of it. It's not perfect, but I think my fair use argument is very strong in the use of video and audio from the episode. I deliberately, when I originally made this, downgraded the audio quality I deliberately downgraded the video quality so that there's no way that you could watch this as a substitute for watching the episode. And because I feel like I wanted to do this for years. I've been anticipating doing this when I return to making online video content on YouTube. In the current climate of racial tension in the spring of 2020 in the U.S., I feel it's especially relevant, even if all the arguments or some of the writing I don't think is exactly optimal, or some of the arguments I made or didn't make are exactly optimal. I really just I think it's time to finally put this up on YouTube. It's been on Dailymotion, I think, or some other video site for 8 years now. But it's time to put it up on YouTube. I feel my fair use argument is strong, and enjoy. My Little Pony: Friendship is Magic is a cartoon in which most of the episodes close with the main character explaining a moral that episode taught them about being a good friend. The intent seems to be to instill children with positive life lessons, both shown in the events of the episode and explained at each episode's conclusion. These morals tend to be vague enough to be tagged at the end of almost anything as an afterthought. I mean, embrace each other's values, being girly doesn't make you weak, compromise, solve disputes, things like that. And really, most of these morals could be just as easily tagged onto an episode of Pokemon and make the same amount of sense. But more than anything, their formulaic insertion into each episode shows that the writers and creators at least have some intention of imbuing young viewers with moral values, even if these values often are an afterthought to what would otherwise be a completely amoral cartoon. However, some episodes do have a more deliberate and overt moral intention. Episode 9 in the first season of Friendship is Magic was clearly written with the specific goal of addressing a very real and serious issue, prejudice, and illustrating to children why prejudice is foolish and admonishable. The episode, entitled Bridle Gossip, begins with series anchor Twilight Sparkle and her dragon buddy Spike strolling into town on a beautiful day to find that the square is completely deserted. The residents are locking their doors, shutting their windows, hiding their children, and generally acting like the world's ending. Twilight and Spike, who only moved to Ponyville at the end of the pilot episode, are mystified as to what's going on until another character in the primary cast, Pinkie Pie, urges them to take cover in her house before she gets them. Inside Pinkie Pie's house, Twilight finds that the remainder of the anchor characters, Rarity, Fluttershy, Rainbow Dash, and Applejack, are also inside, in addition to Applejack's kid sister, Apple Bloom. Applejack explains that they're all hiding from her, and pulls the curtain back to reveal a new equine character standing in town square. Most of her body and face are concealed by a hooded shawl, though enough of her body is shown for the viewer to see that the character is a zebra and not a pony. The zebra is shown pawing in a fierce manner at the ground, and then turns to look at the house where the characters are hiding. The shot reveals nothing of her face, but a sinister pair of glowing eyes. This 9-second sequence, which is our first look at this new character, comes complete with menacing music in the cliché horror movie fashion. The other ponies, save for Apple Bloom, shirk away from the window, frightened that the zebra looks in their direction, while Twilight, unfazed, frowns upon her fellow ponies with harsh disapproval. After the intro sequence rolls, Apple Bloom asks Twilight if she got a good look at the zebra, whose name's Zecora, and Applejack hushes her, saying not to speak Zecora's name out loud, similar to the fear of speaking Voldemort's name in Harry Potter. There's a brief exchange where Twilight accuses the other ponies of flipping out for no good reason, to which the other ponies respond by saying that Zecora is mysterious, sinister, and spooky.
So I swept her up and brought her here, for safekeeping.
Applejack, I'm not a baby. I can take care of myself.
Not from that creepy Zecora.
She's mysterious, sinister, and spooky.
The ponies again look out the window in time to see Zecora remove her hood, revealing properly her striped coat.
Will you cut that out? Just look at those stripes. So garish.
She's a zebra.
A what?
A zebra. And her stripes aren't a fashion choice, Rarity. They're what she was born with.
I mean, think about this for a second. Rarity is so horrified to learn that there's a race of people born with differently colored skin to those of her home region that her immediate reaction is to keel over in abject horror. I mean, would this be an awkward time to mention that I know someone personally who's black and proudly displays a rather large Rarity keychain on their backpack? Anyway, Twilight explains that she's read about zebras and knows that they come from a vaguely described faraway land. Zebras in real life, of course, are exclusively native to the continent of Africa. The introduction of a character whose species is of African descent, who wears exotic clothing and jewelry intended to evoke African culture, and who is discriminated against and prejudged by characters who are clearly cast as being of the major and dominant regional racial majority, creates a large number of issues for this episode that complicate and distract from its moral, and worse yet, put the episode at risk of actually reinforcing the prejudicial mindsets it's trying to eliminate. This episode is supposed to be a demonstration of the foolishness of prejudice, introducing a new coming character whose real-life basis is of explicitly African origin, being subject to unfair treatment on the basis of their skin color by characters who are presumed to be of the racial status quo of Equestria, at once makes this episode a story about a very specific sort of prejudice, that being racism by white people against black people. It's not bad that the episode seems to want to specifically attack racism, and while racism by whites directed against black people has had an especially long, bloody, and unfortunate history, they could have addressed the underlying issues of all prejudice in a much simpler and efficient way than introducing a character of explicitly African origin to be picked on by the ethnically nondescript racial majority of Ponyville. That being said, using real-life regional variances in different equine populations around the world as an analog for skin color in a world where human beings don't exist isn't an inherently bad idea, but in Zecora's case, it's poorly considered and very clumsily implemented. If this episode is about the ponies of Ponyville treating Zecora unfairly because of her genetic background and physical appearance, then why does Zecora need to be an exotic token character oozing with contrived Africanness to set her as far apart from the other characters as possible? Her stripes alone should be more than enough for this purpose. Anyway, Twilight acts as the rational pony in the group and accuses the others of giving in to gossip and rumors, and asks them specifically if they've actually seen Zecora do anything suspicious.
What exactly have you actually seen Zecora do?
Once a month, she comes into Ponyville.
Ooh.
Then she lurks by the stores.
Oh my.
And then she digs at the ground.
Good gracious!
The dialogue and the actual animation that follows it makes a big deal of the fact that Zecora has a habit of digging at the ground, but it's never mentioned again and serves no purpose to the plot. Twilight swiftly diffuses all three of these accusations and specifically proposes, albeit non-committedly, that
maybe she comes to town to visit.
Yeah, maybe she's just trying to be neighborly.
And maybe she's not lurking by the stores. Maybe she's going to them, lurk-free, to do some shopping.
when challenged by the other ponies yet again, Twilight insists that
I'm sure there's an explanation for everything Zecora does.
while Twilight is clearly acting as the designated voice of reason as to why the other ponies are wrong for their prejudgment of Zecora, the idea that Zecora's completely harmless visits to Ponyville warrant an explanation of any kind is the complete opposite of what the writer should be getting at. It presumes Zecora to be guilty and suspicious until proof of her innocence can be ascertained.
And if any pony here were actually brave enough to approach her, she would find out the truth.
While the adult ponies argue, Apple Bloom runs off to follow Zecora and learn the truth about her. While Apple Bloom is clearly being brave and admirable by acting on Twilight Sparkle's words of wisdom that the other ponies are ignoring, she's apprehensive about following her. Though I'd rather her not have been apprehensive about this, it makes more than enough sense in this context and serves the story being told so far well enough. But unfortunately, what it's building up to is yet another massive conceptual misstep. Apple Bloom follows Zecora into the Everfree Forest, a dark, menacing forest where Zecora lives, which the other ponies say is unnatural. Poorly considered, but fairly minor on the list of problems this episode already has. The adult ponies tail the kid into the woods, and Applejack shouts for Apple Bloom to return to her at once. This alludes Zecora to their presence, and she begins speaking to them.
Beware! Beware!
Zecora has a non-committal ethnic accent like the Na'vi, which may be offensive to some, but more than anything, it's just really cliché and sigh-inducing. Furthermore, Zecora always speaks in rhyme, a gimmick held in common by enough black cartoon characters that there's probably a TV trope for it. Though to the show's credit, Zecora is voiced by an African-American voice actress. Zecora delivers what the adult ponies, sans Twilight, take to be either a cryptic threat or a curse against Apple Bloom, before literally vanishing into the forest.
They're the ones who
Applejack yells down Apple Bloom for following Zecora and repeats her fear that the zebra could have placed a curse on her, which Twilight Sparkle debunks, explaining as a magic user, she knows how real magic works, and that evil curses are a superstition with no basis in reality.
There's no such thing as curses. They're just an old ponytail.
Just you wait, Twilight. You're gonna learn that some ponytails really are true.
That night, Twilight has a nightmare about Zecora where we get a recap reinforcing every prejudiced accusation the other ponies have made against Zecora up to this point, including a shot of Zecora with glowing yellow eyes laughing evilly.
Ugh, what a dream. Curses schmerses. Whoa. Maybe Zecora cursed my hair. Or she cursed my horn.
Twilight scours her library for cures for her condition, and thankfully, she specifically demands a rational explanation other than a curse, though she's unable to do so. Spike suggests that she looks for a cure in a book called Supernaturals, which she scoffs at, saying that supernatural refers to the make-believe and couldn't possibly provide a sensible solution to her floppy horn. This book plays into the eventual self-proclaimed moral of this story, so I'll mention that again when that comes up. The other ponies enter Twilight's house and reveal that they've all been afflicted with similar goofy maladies, deep voices, swollen tongues, etc., which they all believe to be effects of a curse that Zecora has placed upon them all. Rarity's curse seems to be that her mane is done up in dreadlocks, but I won't even go there, because this is where this episode really begins to make fatal missteps.
Curse, I tells you!
Remember that the moral of this episode is supposed to be that prejudging people and jumping to conclusions is wrong, and gives us a character all of Ponyville, save for Twilight and Apple Bloom, assume is dangerous and evil because she has a different racial background. Twilight is positioned as the voice of reason, explaining rationally why their distrust and dislike of Zecora based on her appearance is foolish. However, instead of making Zecora in any way sympathetic or relatable, the show instead gives young, impressionable viewers every reason in the world to be afraid of Zecora. Zecora wears a hooded robe when most ponies don't even wear clothes at all. Twice so far, she's been shown to have glowing yellow eyes, and frightening or mysterious music has accompanied her every on-screen appearance. Of Friendship is Magic, 6 anchored characters who children are supposed to relate to and find endearing and likable and have empathy for, 5 of them are deathly afraid of Zecora and repeatedly are given chances to reiterate how evil Zecora is and why they feel their prejudice against her is justified. The only other pony character willing to give Zecora a chance is Apple Bloom, and she's a very young secondary character with minimal development by this point in the series, who's repeatedly hushed and admonished by her elders for speaking and acting against the popular attitudes of the other adult ponies. By nuance, it's clear that the writers and animators want to reinforce that Apple Bloom is acting wisely in eschewing the irrational distrust of Zecora. But in the most apparent sense, what we see instead is a child putting herself and others in possible danger by pursuing a character that the cartoon has made a specific effort to depict as frightening and threatening. In fact, browsing through the comments for this episode where it was posted on YouTube, one can find a YouTube comment that reads as follows. I can't believe Apple Bloom. She has no idea what she's doing, and she thinks she's brave, but she's doing something that could put her in grave danger. Even if Twilight up to this point has continually made the specific case for Zecora's innocence, and for the other ponies to accept her and stop making negative assumptions about her, the episode counteracts this by showing Zecora in ways that at best fail to contradict, and at worst actually reinforce what the prejudiced ponies are saying about her. To add to this, the goofy affliction suffered by all 6 main characters actually gives specific cause for viewers to suspect that Zecora is evil and actually has placed curses on their beloved main characters. Keep in mind that while most everyone of age can probably see straight through this plot and its predictable outcome like a glass catfish, the target audience who it's written for, very young children, should be watching this episode for the first time if the writers are doing anything of a good job, with a genuine sense of suspense and uncertainty. The plot development of all 6 main ponies being supposedly cursed by Sakura after their encounter in the forest is written and presented in such a manner that it's beyond reason to speculate that the creative intent was anything other than to advance the story and raise suspense by raising the possibility in the viewer's mind that Sakura, in spite of Twilight Sparkle's continued protest to the contrary, is evil. A story in which the ponies mistake an innocent, helpful character to be an evil witch who has cursed them is not a bad idea at all. In fact, it can make for a completely unobjectionable mistaken identity episode with a twist ending. But in this episode, attaching it to this character and this context in a story that parallels itself to white against black racism to an extent that perhaps the writers themselves weren't as aware of as they should have been is an egregious error. Here we have an episode in which the moral is that prejudice is wrong, but whose plot, if there's to be any sense of tension, suspense, or surprise intended by the writers, relies entirely on viewers accepting or even expecting that the prejudice is justified, and that the victim of the prejudice is actually possibly the villain of the story.
We'll go to Sakura's and force her to remove this hex.
So great going, writers. Now we have an angry mob of the racial majority planning to go to a racial minority's house to seek retribution for a crime that the person in question didn't commit. I mean, why, writers? Why do this? I mean, was this intentional, or was it an accident? Did you really think that having an episode about prejudice meant that you needed to have a direct, heavy-handed analog to as many aspects of white against black racism that you could possibly squeeze in? Or were you blissfully unaware that this scene in this context parallels actual racial violence that still continues even to this day in America? Either way, the bad decisions made in the handling of this episode just keep piling up. Now, thankfully, in spite of all of this, Twilight still maintains, at least for now, that there's no chance that Sakura has cursed them, and that the other ponies are being silly. They all start arguing over this, and as the adult ponies quarrel, Apple Bloom says,
"This is all my fault. If I hadn't followed Sakura in the first place, none of this would have happened."
And you know what? She's completely and objectively correct. This is literally all Apple Bloom's fault. If she had listened to her big sister and hid indoors with the other ponies when Sakura came to town, rather than following Sakura into the forest in an attempt to reach out and understand her, the 6 main characters would now be in perfect health, going about their business. Talk about mixed messages. Earlier on, Apple Bloom was shown to be doing the right thing by following Twilight's advice about actually getting to know Sakura. But now we see that Apple Bloom's decision to do this unwittingly did put herself and the other ponies in very real and tangible danger. Even if in the end we find out that Sakura didn't curse the other ponies, that doesn't change the fact that what we have here is a case of Apple Bloom doing the right thing in opposing bigotry and being rewarded with a direct negative consequence, which is in turn the creation of the problem that needs solving. These constant mixed messages are the secondary problem this episode suffers from. But the main problem is that the primary action and conflict of this episode isn't a debate over why prejudice is stupid. Instead, the main action and conflict in this episode is a debate over whether or not Sakura is evil. And the episode even goes out of its way to mislead viewers to consider that Sakura being evil is a valid outcome. So, Apple Bloom heads off into the forest again to find Sakura and somehow put everything right. Once the other ponies realize she's missing, they all follow her. The ponies reach Sakura's house, and it's just as cliché and stereotypical as you could possibly expect. It's a stock witch's hut built into a gnarled old tree adorned with vaguely African masks that look like Halloween decorations and potion bottles strewn everywhere. In the midst of all this mock African stuff, for whatever reason, there's a Native American dream catcher on Sakura's front door. And while I'm at it, Sakura's neck rings seem to be more Burmese in origin than African to me. Rarity and Pinkie Pie mention that Sakura's house looks horrible and that it has creepy decorations. After spying on Sakura mixing a cauldron, even Twilight begins to admit that it looks like Sakura's evil after all.
Now do you believe us, Twilight? Everything is pointing to Sakura being bad. Or what if Sakura's just making soup?
The perfect temperature for ponies, I presume. Now, where is that little apple bloom?
Or what if she's making apple bloom soup?
I'm coming for you, Apple Bloom!
Oh, that is in the wall!
Whoa there!
Oh, balik ko! Huwag! Mali! Mali!
What have you done with apple bloom?
No! No! Mali! You know not what you do. You've gone and spilled my precious brew.
We're on to you, Sakura. I didn't want to believe that you cursed us, but the evidence is overwhelming.
So much for what Twilight said earlier about curses not being real, huh?
They're just an old ponytail. There's no such thing as curses. I didn't want to believe that you cursed us, but the evidence is overwhelming.
Just as Twilight and Sakura actually start butting heads like they're about to fight, Apple Bloom walks in, to the surprise of all the other ponies. She mocks Twilight for giving in to her peers' nonsense about a curse.
You can't just stand there and tell me this isn't a curse.
This isn't a curse.
If you will remember back, the words I spoke were quite exact.
Sakura then explains that what she was reciting earlier in the episode was a warning to avoid the blue leaves they were stepping in, which are a plant called poison joke, which causes prank-like maladies to those who touch it. Sakura then goes on to say that her speech earlier was just a nursery rhyme, though she always talks in rhyme anyway, so that detail is completely pointless. And the fact that Sakura was aware that she was being cryptic, rather than just stating outright for the ponies to get away from the blue plants, is questionable, but whatever.
When we ran in to save Apple Bloom, we ran into the poison joke. All our problems are just little jokes that played on us. But the cauldron, the Apple Bloom soup?
Looky here, Twilight. That pot of water wasn't for me. It was for all these herbal ingredients. The cure for poison joke is a simple, all-natural remedy. You just gotta take a bubble bath.
But I tried to find a cure in all my books and couldn't find anything. What book has this natural remedy?
Here is the book, you see? Sad that you lack it in your library.
Actually, I do have this book, but I didn't look inside because the title was so weird. Supernaturals. Natural remedies and cure-alls that are simply super. I'm so sorry, Sakura.
Maybe next time you will take a second look and not judge the cover of the book.
Don't judge a book by its cover. That's nice, but in this case, the books in question, both Sakura and the literal Book of Cures, are deliberately misrepresented to the viewers in order to mislead them. This is akin to having a TV show where a Muslim character is reading a book named How to Build a Suicide Bomb, which actually turns out to be a vegetarian cookbook. We're naturally going to draw certain conclusions about the contents of the book. It turns out that the last ingredient Sakura needs for her medicine are only sold in Ponyville, but she's unable to obtain it because Ponyville is a racist hick town that locks down all its stores whenever Sakura tries to shop there.
Daisy, we need to talk.
Twilight Sparkle then gives the entire town a stern talking to off-screen, after which all is well, the ponies enjoy their curative bubble bath, which by the way has no bubbles in it at all, and Twilight delivers her once-per-episode mandatory letter to Princess Celestia, in which the supposed moral of this story is explained to the viewers.
Dear Princess Celestia, my friends and I all learned an important lesson this week. Never judge a book by its cover. Someone may look unusual or funny or scary, but you have to look past that and learn who they are inside. Real friends don't care what your cover is. It's the contents of a pony that count. And a good friend, like a good book, is something that will last forever. Your faithful student, Twilight Sparkle.
That's all well and good. I'll ignore the detail that the show establishes that Sakura literally isn't even considered a pony in this world, and instead comments on the fact that it was too bad this episode couldn't have actually been about what Twilight wrote in her letter. what was probably conceived as an episode about an innocent character being unfairly prejudged on the basis of their physical appearance was instead carried out as a story in which the cartoon deliberately misleads viewers with a character falsely represented as scary and unsympathetic who were given no chance to relate to, and even gives us false evidence justifying the protagonist's distrust of her.
Yes.
Instead of being an episode which concerns itself with Twilight and Apple Bloom making friends with Sakura and proving why Ponyville's prejudice against her is unfounded, the episode instead concerns itself with a literal witch hunt in which the ponies are either trying to prove or disprove that Sakura is evil. In fact, Sakura not being evil is treated by this episode as a twist ending. They created a new character for the sole purpose of being a victim to prejudice, to show why prejudice is wrong, and then they blew it by making that same character the presumed villain until she can be proven not to be evil. To deliberately repeat myself, this episode doesn't show why prejudice is wrong. Instead, it shows our 6 main characters, including Twilight, attempting to resolve the question of prejudice by trying to prove or disprove whether or not Sakura is evil, rather than by actually dealing with the prejudice itself as the problem at hand. The problem at hand isn't the prejudice, it's the debate over whether or not Sakura is evil, and this is where the moral of this episode tries to convey falls apart entirely. It isn't nearly as difficult for children's entertainment to address prejudice, jumping to wrong conclusions, or even overt racism as the developers of this episode of My Little Pony made it for themselves. Many kids shows, including cartoons meant for children under 10, have addressed this issue without suffering even a percentage of the conceptual missteps Bridle gossip suffers. Hell, even the original Thomas the Tank Engine books from the 1950s, with their steam engine versus diesel engines conflict, did a better job of addressing prejudice than this My Little Pony episode. And even one of the Thomas books from that time period featured an indefensible use of the N-word to describe children who were vandalizing the trains. So, how could this episode have been improved? Well, here are just 3 ideas to start with. 1. Better use of the 6 main characters. In the opening sequence, these 6 characters were singing a song about how friendship and kindness were the best things in the universe. Yet in this actual episode, all of them except for Twilight spend the entirety of the episode being prejudiced bigots, and by the end even Twilight joins in. Each of these characters has a unique personality, and each of them has strengths and weaknesses and character shticks. Being shy, being outgoing, being booksort, being vain, and so on. So why weren't these better leveraged to advance the moral of the story rather than simply taking up time with dialogue and jokes? It's good for main characters to have serious flaws or make mistakes, especially when these flaws aren't resolved in a single episode. In fact, the original Thomas the Tank Engine books had one steam engine character take many books in order to overcome his racism against diesels, which is depicted as a major triumph when it finally does happen. Character flaws are good, but they should be consistently portrayed. Don't just cast the entire population of the world with a single light just because it's convenient for the sake of this badly executed moral dilemma. If Rarity, Applejack, and Rainbow Dash were fearful of Sakura, while Twilight and Fluttershy and Apple Bloom were taking the moral high ground of acceptance, with Pinkie Pie serving as neutral comic relief, there would have been a much more room for an actual discussion and conflict amongst the characters over prejudice itself, and not just Twilight unsuccessfully attempting to persuade all the characters out of this mindset before eventually going along with it by the climax of the episode. Improvement number 2. Cut down on the mixed messages. Twilight says the zebras are from a faraway land. They're born looking different from Ponyville ponies and shouldn't be feared based on that alone. Yet every on-screen appearance Sakura makes in this episode's first half is accompanied by horror movie-style suspenseful music, and her eyes are shown to glow yellow in a completely unnatural and frightening way. To the show's credit, this is actually played up for laughs at one point.
That's just it. She lives in the Everfree Forest. Bye! Sorry.
But the mixed messages that this sends children are still intact. Another mixed message is when Twilight lectures the adult ponies about how if they were to actually meet Sakura and were brave enough to approach her, they would learn the truth about her. Apple Bloom then immediately acts on this advice, and the direct result is that by following Sakura, she actually does put the other ponies in real and tangible danger to which she's specifically responsible for. Even if in the end we learn that the danger wasn't caused by Sakura herself, the mixed message this sends remains intact. A character set up to be a foil for the other character's prejudice acts on her beliefs and directly proves that Applejack was right for telling her not to adventure into the forest to pursue Sakura. Improvement number 3. Make Sakura a sympathetic character from the start instead of deliberately distancing viewers from her and then revealing her innocent and helpful nature on screen at the end of the episode to serve as a twist ending. When Sakura is in Ponyville, why not actually show how she's hurt by the entire town being afraid of her? Heck, even show her crying about it. We see her approaching every store in town trying to find a shop that'll open its doors to her, but we don't get to see her emotions at all during this scene. In fact, this scene is deliberately played up for suspense and making it out as though Sakura might actually be up to something bad, lurking as the other ponies accuse her of doing. Even if nothing else in this episode were to have been changed, just seeing Apple Bloom's first face-to-face meeting with Sakura on screen would have helped the narrative enormously. Instead, this happens off-screen, and the fact that Sakura has been helping Apple Bloom create a cure for the adult ponies is only revealed as part of the twist ending. For a show that proclaims itself to convey moral values to children, going as far as to bill itself as an educational and informative program along the likes of Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, formerly carrying an on-screen EI tag when it aired on television, Bridle Gossip is an absolute train wreck. If I were a parent, the thought that this half-hour pageant of fail and discordancy was somehow educational would be an insult not only to my intelligence, but to the intelligence of my child. If only Sakura had just been another ethnically ambiguous pastel-colored pony, and not a zebra smothered in African motifs and ethnic cliches, and this story wasn't written as an Aesop about prejudice, then Bridle Gossip, at its absolute worst, would be a slightly flawed story about jumping to the wrong conclusions. However, because it's supposed to be a moral story about the absurdity and erroneousness of prejudice, especially racial prejudice, Bridle Gossip is a poorly conceived, misdirected mess that completely fails at its intended purpose, other than perhaps its underlying intent of pushing a line of derpy-looking toy horses with combable hair. Even with all that Bridle Gossip as an individual episode of this series has going against it, placing its mangled message about eschewing prejudice in the context of the adult My Little Pony fandom magnifies the severity of its failure by 1,000. My Little Pony Friendship is Magic developed an adult fan base who some would even consider a subculture. And while there are countless awesome, friendly, harmless fans who identify themselves as part of this subculture, it's also suffered an undeniable, widespread, highly visible, widely documented element of persistent, hard-bodied, unapologetic intolerance and prejudice of all kinds, including extreme racism directed at non-whites. Non-white fans cosplaying as characters from the show are, as a matter of common occurrence, subject to racial slurs and hate speech from white fans of My Little Pony. Fan artists who dare to in any way depict the My Little Pony characters in a fashion that's perceived to be non-white can expect to get hateful responses from racist fans claiming that the ponies are white Caucasians, and that any suggestion to the otherwise is unacceptable, and ruins the fun of My Little Pony by making it politically correct or by pandering to minorities. This racism and general bigotry have become so prevalent throughout the adult My Little Pony subculture that there are entire blogs dedicated to chronicling it, and there's even a counter-movement of fans deliberately drawing My Little Pony characters as non-Caucasians just to further piss off the racists. And sadly, for the creators of this show, who surely never meant for this to happen, Their efforts in writing Bridle gossip did absolutely nothing to quell this. In fact, some of these racist My Little Pony enthusiasts actually argue that Bridle gossip supports that it's unacceptable for fans to pick Twilight, Fluttershy, and any of the other ponies as anything except for white Caucasians, because they claim that black people in the world of Friendship is Magic are represented exclusively by zebras, an idea which Bridle gossiply actually somewhat enshrines as canon, even if that wasn't the intention of the creators, which I don't think it was. Though the thought of ponies as Caucasian analogs is further reinforced by a later episode where the ponies are sub-ins for white Old West settlers and come in conflict with Buffalo, who are generic Indians. So, is My Little Pony Friendship is Magic racist? No. Is Sakura a racist caricature? No. Even with all I've said about Sakura, I don't find her to be offensive or racist. Poorly considered in parts, absolutely, but as a character divorced from the baggage of her introductory episode, she's actually a fun on-screen presence. Ultimately, of course, I'm vividly aware that what I'm reviewing here is a cartoon intended for small children. Every kid's cartoon, even the good ones, can be nitpicked and dissected by overly analytical adults until the cows come home for any number of reasons. I get it, it's for kids, I accept that it's for children, but I won't accept that as an excuse for an episode of a cartoon totally sucking due to the faults of the educated, professional adults who put it together. When a cartoon sets out to disseminate good moral values to children on serious topics such as prejudice, it should actually do that. Bridle gossip, however, doesn't do that. That's my opinion, and thanks for watching.
Rangers, ever tackle a job you really look forward to doing? Oh boy, you say, rubbing your hands together, that's for me, that's right up my alley. Well, there's one big job that's right up everybody's alley, Rangers. That's the job of fighting discrimination. Seeing to it that the next fellow gets a fair chance, regardless of his race or religion. We've all got a talent for that, if we know how to use it. It comes under the heading of friendship. When we like people and are genuinely interested in them, there's no room for un-American prejudice. So all we have to do is to keep on making new friends. Easy as pie. There's another reason why fighting discrimination ought to be up everybody's alley, because those who turn thumbs down on one race or religion one day are just as apt to turn against another race or religion another day. Yours maybe, who knows? So when you fight for an equal chance for everyone in your club, on your team, in jobs of all kinds, you're fighting your own battle too, Rangers. Now back to Captain Video.